Bloody Hundredth got its name because of our tremendous losses. All of Europe was occupied. The minute we crossed the coast, we were over enemy territory. Pilot of a flight of 2 FW-190s impacted the ship in front of me and knocked them out of the formation and exploded. Well, the operations officer, who's the second in command of the squadron, was flying in that airplane. His pilot was on his 24th mission. I'm John Lucky Luckadoo, and the nickname comes not only from my last name, but the fact that I was actually lucky enough to have survived a combat tour with the 8th Air Force, particularly the Bloody Hundredth Bomb Group that I was assigned to during World War II. I was born and grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is sometimes known as the cradle of the Confederacy, dating back to the Civil War, and grew up actually on Missionary Ridge, which was one of the famous battles of the Civil War, which took place on November the 25th of 1863. Of course, had public schooling during my academic career, and prior to Pearl Harbor, having graduated from high school, my best friend and I decided that we would be cool if we were to go to Canada, join the RCAF, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and get our flight training and be a step ahead of all of our buddies, because we knew that our involvement, or America's involvement in World War II, was inevitable. Anyway, when we applied to the RCAF for application, they greeted us with open arms and said they'd love to have us and train us. But because we were only 18 years old at that time, it required parental consent. And Sully, my best friend, was an only child because his father had been mustard gassed in the First World War and died a horrible death when he was barely born. So he never knew his father. But being an only child, he was somewhat doubtful that maybe his mother would agree to or give her consent to his going to. However, she took a rather philosophical position on the question and said, Sully, if this is what you really feel you should do, then you have my blessing. And so I went home thinking that my parents would react the same way. And as it worked out, my mother, knowing that Mrs. Sullivan was willing to consent to her only child to go to Canada, said, well, if that's what you all think you should do, why, I'm okay with it. My dad took an entirely different view. He thought it was the most idiotic thing he'd ever heard of, that here we were not involved. America was not involved in the war in any way, although, of course, the British at that time were being hard-pressed by Hitler and on the brink of invasion, as a matter of fact. And so they had done everything they could to get us involved, but although we supported them with war material and loans and things of that nature, we did not, or Roosevelt, President Roosevelt at that time, did not have the backing of the American public to enter war. And he was sure that the Japanese were going to attack us, but he didn't know when or where. That's been proven since. It was not known at that time. But at any rate, my father refused to give his consent, and he said over his dead body would he agree that, that I go, and it was none of my business, and to get back in school. So my friend did go to Canada and did get trained and was posted out into North Africa and flying Spitfires against the German army, chasing Rommel and the occupying forces in North Africa. In the meantime, about a year later, Pearl Harbor occurred. And of course, at that time, I was in my second year of college, and every able-bodied American was expected to be patriotic and to step up to the plate and enlist. If you volunteered, you could select the branch of service that you served in. And so I immediately volunteered for the Army Air Corps, since I still wanted to fly, and was accepted. And so in 1942, I became an aviation cadet and proceeded through primary, basic, and advanced training, and ended up in Valdosta, Georgia in early 1943, February, and graduated from the multi-engine school, which meant that I would be a bomber pilot and not a fighter pilot. Most people that enlisted in the Air Corps in those days envisioned being a fighter pilot because they had more fun. They were pretty much free spirits, and they only had their own butts to be concerned with, whereas a bomber pilot had a crew on his shoulders, in addition to being able to fly the airplane and to get to the target and back safely. Different type of service altogether. But upon graduation from flying school, strangely enough, 40 of my classmates and myself were assigned to a B-17 group that was then stationed in Kearney, Nebraska, about to go overseas. So we were suddenly plucked out of school and into the right seat of a B-17 that we'd never been in before, and about to be sent overseas. Well, as far as we can tell, no other group in history had ever had this done to them. It was a very drastic move to make. Who was responsible for it, we never knew. The reason apparently was that they had been inspected by an inspector general who flew with them on a mock bombing range to San Francisco, in which they encountered a bunch of cloud cover and split up the group. They flew all over, and the commanding officer landed in Las Vegas, and two of the crews landed, one in Virginia and the other in Tennessee. And we found out later that they both had girlfriends and where they went. But the Inspector General threw up his hands and he said, well, you guys certainly don't have any air discipline, so you're not certified for overseas service. Well, the crews in the group had been all the way through 3 phases of pre-combat training prior to our arrival. But when this happened, the group was split up into squadrons. There were 4 squadrons. Each squadron sent to a different air base, as instructors for crews that were going overseas. They themselves weren't qualified to go, but they were to be instructors for those that were going. That's the military for you, or military intelligence. At any rate, this only lasted for 2 or 3 weeks because the press for bomber crews in England in early 1943 was enormous. The British were being hard pressed by the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, and Hitler was threatening invasion. The Battle of Britain had already taken place, and they barely succeeded in turning the German Air Force back at that time. So the pressure for groups to come over and join the 8th Air Force, which was assisting Britain in resisting the Nazis, was really tremendous. Consequently, they pulled all of us back together again in Kearney, issued us brand new aircraft, which had been modified for the long hop from the States over to England, 14 hours. And said, well, you guys are going to be killed anyway, you might as well go to combat. We landed in Newfoundland, and it was a 12-hour hop from Newfoundland to Prestwick, Scotland. In order to make that, even with the additional fuel that we were carrying, which overloaded us, we had to have a favorable tailwind or we wouldn't make it. And at that time, of course, the North Atlantic was being plied by the German submarines, the wolf packs, that were attacking all of the shipping, that tremendous amount of shipping, and they were sinking an awful lot of it. And so they positioned themselves to be sending out radio signals that would misdirect us and have us fly off into the toward the Azores or south and miss England altogether and never be heard from. But while we were there waiting for a favorable tailwind, the pilot that I was assigned to took it upon himself to go across the base one night and got with a British WAF and ended up with a raging case of venereal disease in the hospital. And so as a consequence, the rest of the group got the favorable tailwind and they took off individually and went ahead. And my crew sat there twiddling our thumbs for 2 weeks, waiting for him to be released. And of course, this was a terrible embarrassment to him. He was married, had a child, for which we named the plane. And this is a replica of the plane that we flew over with that he named Sunny, S-U-N-N-Y. And he was pretty chagrined that this would happen. Unfortunately, at that time in history, the only thing they could treat them, people with VD, was with sulfa. And it was very debilitating. He'd been flat of his back for 2 weeks. So he was weak as a kitten when he finally was released. He couldn't stand up. And we literally had to load him into the airplane. And he said, well, Lucky, you're going to have to fly this thing because we're ready to go. And of course, as the co-pilot, you're second in command of the crew, 10-man crew. And the only training that I had received or any of my fellow classmates was from their pilots as to what we might be expected to be confronted with. So I had been pretty highly resented on my particular crew by the fact that the co-pilot that I replaced was a favorite of theirs, and they buddied with him and hung out with him and liked him very much. And they'd been all the way through training together, and they were sort of joined at the hip. And they highly resented that a shaved tail like me, that didn't have any familiarity with the aircraft or what we were supposed to be doing, would be replacing him. So they made my life sure hell. Did the best they could to discourage me force me off the crew if they could. But I withstood all of their onslaughts, and I called them over when the pilot was finally released, and I said to the navigator that he better hit the landfall in Scotland on the nose, or I would personally throw him out of the airplane without a parachute. And so that sort of leveled the playing field. But at any rate, we did successfully make landfall and landed in Scotland, and then proceeded from there down to Thorpe Abbots in East Anglia in England, where our base was situated. And being a couple of weeks behind everybody else, we didn't have the benefit of practice missions or any preparation. We were immediately thrown into combat. Flew our first mission, and the Bloody Hundredth got its name because of our tremendous losses. We had no fighter escort that could accompany us beyond the enemy coast. All of Europe was occupied. The minute we crossed the coast, we were over enemy territory. And these guys that we were confronted with, the German Air Force, were pros. They'd been fighting for 4 years. Eastern Front against the Russians, Western Front against the British. They knew what they were doing. They were very practiced, and they were defending their homeland. So their backs were against the wall. And here we were playing in their backyard.
In Washington, Mildred Gillers, known to thousands of GIs as Axis Sally, has been found guilty of treason after a lengthy trial. Accused of being a sort of lady haw-haw because of her broadcasts on Hitler's wartime radio, and having now been convicted, she's driven off to await her sentence. It could be life imprisonment or the supreme penalty. The decision had not been reached as they took her away.
And when we arrived in England, Axis Sally came on the high-frequency radio that they beamed out of Berlin, saying, well, welcome to the war, 100th Bomb Group, and named our commanding officers and people in the group. They knew all about us. They knew we'd arrived there, and they said, you've made a terrible mistake. This is not your war, it's not your business, but now that you're here, we're going to teach you a lesson. And boy, did they. So, because, as I mentioned, our losses were extreme, we were going out in broad daylight, high altitude, unpressurized. This airplane had no pressurization. We had to be on oxygen from 10,000 feet up. We were normally bombing from an altitude of 6 miles, nearly 30,000 feet. Temperatures at that altitude were minus 50 to 60 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. And so this was, one of our enemies was freezing. And we were really inhibited as to how we could efficiently operate under those conditions. But we had to do it. We had no choice. The pilot of the crew that I was assigned to was determined that he was going to do the fastest tour that anybody had done, had to do 25 missions, and he swore that he was going to, he volunteered us for every mission. And so we started in and just were flying daily. Even in the face of huge losses, and so it was a very, very sobering and maturing process almost instantly to be contending with all of these factors that we were dealing with. And some people withered under the onslaught and refused to fly. And of course, if that were the case, then they'd be jerked out and sent to the infantry or removed immediately because they'd ruin the morale of all the other crewmen that had to continue flying. We did that, have that to contend with. But during the course of our missions, and we were racking them up rapidly, and so in order to redeem himself, he was insistent that he was going to be the first to finish up. Your average life of a crew at that time was 4 missions. So if you were lucky enough to survive at least 4, you were on borrowed time. During the course of the missions, it was deemed that if your crew led the formation, or led the squadron or the group, the co-pilot was removed and required to go back and fly in the tail gun position. And a command pilot would take his place, and he would be in command of the entire formation. The airplane commander or the pilot would still be in control of his crew and his airplane, but his co-pilot would be in charge of the entire formation and all of the rendezvous with other groups and formations, and also direct the navigators as to whether they bombed the target or they didn't. In those days, our rules of engagement involved withholding bombing if we couldn't visually identify the target. So many times we would fight our way all the way into Germany, and the target would be obscured and we couldn't drop. We had the alternative to go to a secondary target. If it were closed, then we had to bring the bombs back and drop them in the channel, because to land with them was very dangerous. But those were the rules we were operating under, and it was not uncommon for us to go all the way to the target and subject ourselves to being killed every minute and still not be able to accomplish our mission. We'd still get credit for a combat mission even though we didn't succeed in hitting the target. But when I was placed in the tail as a tail gunner, never having fired a .50 caliber in my life, I very innocently, once we were under attack, just bore down on the triggers, burned out both barrels, and I was useless as a side saddle on a sow, sitting back there without ability to hit anything or to do anything other than call out what was going on from that direction. That was the concept that put the co-pilot in the tail of the lead ship. He was ostensibly the fire control officer for the formation in the rear direction. Well, whoever dreamed that one up had their head up and locked, because tail gunner could only communicate with the pilot over the intercom. He didn't have any connection or any communication with anybody else in the group or the formation. And he would have to call the pilot and tell him what was happening, and the pilot would then have to switch channels and notify the rest of the formation. By then, the danger was gone. So it was a different situation altogether. I did that one time, and having burned out the barrels, I said, I was trained as a pilot, not as a gunner. You gave me no training whatsoever, and I'm not going to get in the tail again. So you can court-martial me or do whatever you need to do, but I'm not flying in the tail. Consequently, this crew continued to fly and lead, and they ended up in September. They did it in 91 days. They did a tour of 25 missions of England in the beginning of the war. And that was unheard of. That was a record that was never, as far as I know, was never equal. And so I still had 4 missions to go when they finished up. And consequently, on my next mission, I was put with another crew as a command pilot because I was one of the senior experienced pilots in the group. With 21 missions under my belt, you know, I was practically a saint. And all these other guys who were, you know, had half that many, perhaps. So we were on a very tough mission. Lost 9 airplanes out of the group on a raid to Bremen on October the 8th. And the plane immediately in front of me, I was leading the second element of the low squadron in the low group. It's called the Purple Heart Corner because the Luftwaffe generally attacked the fringes of the formation, and you were on the fringe, plus you were closer to the anti-aircraft shells that were being shot up from the ground. And they were very effective because we lost almost as many crews from anti-aircraft bombing as or munitions as we did from the fighters. But they were flying directly into our formations, and this flight of 2 out of the corner of my eye was aiming right for us. And the lead pilot of a flight of 2 FW-190s impacted the ship in front of me and knocked them out of the formation and exploded. Well, the operations officer, who's the second in command of the squadron, was flying in that airplane. His pilot was on his 24th mission. And of course, I saw them explode, and our fighter flare and what was left of the formation formed on me, and we tacked on to a following wave from another group who had lost a whole squadron, and that's how we got back or survived that particular mission. But when I landed, the squadron commander came up to me and he said, "Well, where is Barker?" Barker was the ops officer in the crew ship in front of me. And I said, "Well, I saw them explode, so everybody was killed. He's not coming back." And so he immediately appointed me as his replacement, as the operations officer. So as the operations officer of a squadron, you are second in command of the squadron, and I was still a second lieutenant. So I said, well, it's going to be a little awkward because here I am directing captains and majors and telling them when they're going to fly and how they're going to fly. And I said, I'm still only a second lieutenant. And they said, well, your promotion is coming through, and it did at the end of that month. And in the combat zone, they can promote you every 3 months, every 90 days. And he said, well, you know, you'll be entitled to increase in rank as fast as we can promote you. So at any rate, I became responsible for a lot more than just a crew, but all of the crews of that squadron. And if the squadron commander was unable or incapacitated or was off the base or anything, of course that left me in command of the squadron. It also meant that if our squadron was designated as the leader of the formation, that either the commanding officer or the operations officer would fly in the co-pilot's position in the lead ship as a command pilot in charge of the formation. So I was to get the rest of my missions in as a command pilot. My original crew, of course, finished up and was returned to the States as instructors. Unfortunately, the navigator that I'd had a lot of trouble with and particularly liked was transitioned onto B-29s, and he and a pilot friend of his that got him onto his crew crashed into a mountain in Montana and were all killed after he had gone through his complete tour over in Europe. But they were preparing to go to the Pacific, of course, in B-29s, because we never did yet have any B-29s that were operational in the European theater. It was a matter of luck. You could be as proficient in what you did or how you did it or focused on your mission and perform it well, but you could zig when you should have zagged, and you never knew whether you were going to, a bullet had your name on it or not. So it was a pretty traumatic experience. The cold, as I mentioned earlier, was a tremendous enemy. We really considered we had not one enemy but four. The first was fear. We were constantly afraid that on any mission we were either going to be shot down, captured, killed, or whatnot. And you never knew. But when you got in that airplane and went out flying in broad daylight, high altitude, mass formations, you didn't know whether that was your last one or not. So that took its toll on many people, and I don't think anybody, as a result of doing that, came back the same person. You not only had to face your morality of being a killer or be killed, or your mortality as to whether you survived. And that was a pretty ominous prospect to live with as a 21-year-old. Most of us in front of the airplane, we had a bombardier, navigator, pilot, and co-pilot who were all officers. And the rest of the 6 members of the crew were enlisted men. And it was, I think, as I look back on it now, after 75 years, 76 this year, that it was just sheer luck and good fortune that I managed to make it. I had a guardian angel on my shoulder, or I was lucky. I'm now writing my memoirs about what it was like, and I'm calling the book Damn Lucky. Hope that'll be published by the end of this year. But I did finally manage to complete my tour in February of 1944. We went overseas in the end of May and 1st of June in 1943, and I completed my tour and was rotated back to the States as an instructor as a result of that. and was still one of the earliest combat returnees to be back in the States. One of the first things they did when I did return was to send me to the only instrument pilot school they had in America down in Bryan, Texas. And I said, gee whiz, I needed this before I went over there, not after. But it was excellent training, and I was lucky again because that's where I met my future wife. I established a combat crew inspection team in Florida, MacDill Field, Tampa, Florida, and checked out these various replacement crews that were going over, and they weren't going over as a bomb group or a squadron or a unit. They were going over individually to replace crews that had been lost in various units in England. And so I was evaluating them and giving them some benefit of my experience as to what they could expect and what they'd have to do in order to combat it and that sort of thing. I was also checked out or transitioned onto B-29s, and I was eligible, therefore, to be sent to the Pacific to fight another war. Even though I had survived and completed a tour in Europe, the war in Japan was still in progress, and we had to defeat them as well. One day I received a phone call, and they said, Lucky, we want you to take this B-29 to the graveyard. And I said, where's that? And they said, it's in Pyote, Texas. So I said, okay. And I went out on the ramp to get in the airplane, and it was the Enola Gay, the airplane that Paul Tibbets had flown to bomb Hiroshima. And I thought, my aching back, they're going to put this in the graveyard. It's obsolete, and of course it had been modified for that particular mission and all, but at any rate I did fly it out to Pyote and parked it. And as I was shown to a parking place, and there were acres of B-29s and B-17s and C-47s and B-26s, every kind of airplane, as far as the eye could see. But there was this brand new B-29 right next to me. And I got up in the cockpit and saw that the logbook showed 3 hours and 22 minutes. It had been flown from the factory in Renton, Washington, the Boeing factory, directly to the graveyard. Because it had already been paid for, it had already been produced, and yet it was considered obsolete. So I left the Enola Gay there, and sure enough, even though they had pulled the props and drained all of the fluids and encased it in plastic and this sort of thing to preserve it in case they did want to rehabilitate it, the Smithsonian Institution finally got their head screwed on and said, well, this is a historic relic and we've got to reclaim it. And so they went out and put it together again and fired it up and flew it to Washington, and that was its last flight. So I flew it one time next to its last flight. I later met Paul Tibbets here in Dallas, one of the original founders of this museum, the Frontiers of Flight Museum. Bill Cooper was a B-29 pilot in the Pacific, and he knew of Paul Tibbets, the pilot of the Enola Gay, and had learned that the Smithsonian was going to put the airplane on display with a plaque saying that it dropped a bomb that should never have been dropped. And the B-29 pilots that had flown, including Tibbets, were just irate because they said it saved many more lives than it took, and therefore it should never be displayed under those conditions. And so Cooper and some of his buddies got Tibbets to go around the country and dispute what the Smithsonian intended to do, and they succeeded in getting the guy that was responsible for it fired. So it does now reside at Dulles, at Udvar Hazy in Washington, and properly displayed as the bomb that ended World War II, the bomber that ended World War II. So I was privileged to meet Tibbets when he came through on his lecture tour, and Bill Cooper had my wife and I join him for dinner, and I got to relate to him my experience in flying his airplane, and had the opportunity to ask him if he were ever to be ordered to do the same thing again, would he do it? And he said, in a New York minute. And he was thoroughly convinced that he had done the right thing to be the instrument that succeeded in finally bringing Japan to its senses and having them surrender instead of having to invade the island, which would have been disastrous because they were fanatic. They would have fought to the last man, woman, and child. First mission that I flew as a command pilot after leaving the crew that I originally went over with, my 22nd mission, in other words, to Bremen, Germany on October the 8th of '43, was undoubtedly the worst mission that I flew, and the one in which I really had serious doubts that I was going to survive because of our tremendous losses, the way it occurred. We were on our bomb run, just turned on our bomb run, and the flak had bracketed us totally, and even at altitude, they were highly accurate, and we lost 12 ships like that instantaneously out of an 18-ship formation. So of the only 6 that were left, I brought those six back. I lost an engine over the target. We went ahead and did drop our bombs successfully, but only had 3 engines, and that's very difficult to maintain the speed with the rest to keep up with the rest of the formation. So I was nursing this 4th engine carefully and trying to get some power out of it and still not stall out or have to leave the formation, because once you did and you were alone, that's when the Germans would jump you, and that's what they waited for, was you to be knocked out of the formation and not have to be confronted with the mutual firepower of the whole group to ward them off. But that was really my worst mission. The other one that I flew that was, I flew several that were memorable. One was a mission that to Saint-Nazaire, which was a submarine installation, and the British were very hopeful that we could seriously damage it because of the tremendous success the submarine corps, the German submarine corps was having in sinking shipping. That was my longest mission. That was 11 hours from takeoff to landing. And to be stuck in that seat, and literally we were stuck, because when we wore all this heavy flying equipment to withstand the cold, and plus our flak vest and our Mae West inflatable thing, our parachute harness and parachutes and flak vest and all of this other stuff. Behind the pilot and the co-pilot were these slabs of armor plate, and between those was only a foot, 12 inches. So literally, even though I only weighed 125 pounds at that time, I was pretty slim and skinny. I couldn't get through there with all that stuff on. We used to have to shinny through it and then put on much of that equipment. But that was unless you were on fire. And then you could go through a knothole and not touch either side. It was amazing what you could do when the adrenaline was flowing. But another thing that we encountered that might be of interest to you is that because of the bitter cold and the possibility of frostbite, and that incidentally was the only physical damage or wound that I received in my whole tour, was frostbitten feet. And they were frozen so solidly to the rudder pedals that they had to chip me out and take me up to the hospital. But in the heat of battle, when you're jockeying and trying to stay in formation, you're concentrating on dropping your bombs and all of this sort of thing, even in those temperatures, you find yourself perspiring profusely. And that perspiration around your oxygen mask freezes instantly. Fast freezes. And so you've got these ice crystals that are blocking your oxygen flow. And you've got to take one hand and break up these ice crystals and fly the airplane with the other. Well, that's just one of the things we had to contend with. I was offered the possibility of accepting a regular commission when the Air Force became a separate branch in 1947. I was still in the service, and they offered certain reserve officers the possibility of taking an exam and accepting a regular commission in the regular Air Force, which meant you were set for life. You made the military your career, and of course committed to 25 or 30 years of service. I did take the exam and accepted the commission, and at that point they announced that they had a program where these newly integrated regular officers could go to any college in America that they could qualify for. Their credits were accepted, and still retain full pay and allowances, including flying pay, to complete their education. And so I applied for that and was accepted out at Stanford in California. And I thought, well, I only had 2 years of college, and I certainly want to get at least a bachelor's degree. And so this is my opportunity to do that. And was anxiously awaiting orders and never got them. And at that point, I was stationed over in Fort Worth at Carswell in 8th Air Force Headquarters. as the Operations and Training Inspector and Inspector, the Air Inspectors Division. And so I cranked up an airplane and flew down to the Air University in Montgomery Field and at Maxwell Field in Montgomery, Alabama. And they were administering the program, and I said, "You've got this great program for newly integrated officers. I've been accepted, but I've never gotten any orders. How come?" And they said, "Well, how old are you?" And I said, "I'm 26. And they said, "Well, you realize we have an age limit of 32 in this program." And I said, "Yeah, so what?" And they said, "Well, so the pipeline is so filled with people ahead of you that if they don't get in before their 32nd birthday, they lose out." And I said, "Well, I can appreciate that, but how long am I going to have to wait to get in the pipeline?" And they said, "Well, according to our calculations, until just before your 32nd birthday." So I came back to Carswell with my tail between my legs, and I thought, well, gee whiz, this is, having to wait 6 more years. I'd been out of college 6 years then. Just to go back and hit the books is pretty awesome. And so I talked it over with my wife, and I said, I could go back to college under the GI Bill as a civilian, and I wouldn't have to wait 6 years. And I think I'll resign my commission. So I did.